And thank you, Franco, and everyone who was part of the organizing for inviting me. It's a treat to talk to an audience I wouldn't normally talk to, though I have to admit, when I first got Franco's email, I wrote back basically saying, no. I can connect you with people who are studying literary texts if you want that. And he convinced me to just come and talk about these issues in Corpus Linguistics. So I'm hoping that I can offer you some interesting perspectives from Corpus Linguistics, and I think I will certainly show you some text samples that are different than the things you are used to looking at. So that'll give a little variation for the afternoon anyway. And as you can see, that's my title there. And what I was trying to get at with it, and when this is kind of the spoiler alert, so I'm jumping to the very end of the talk. You might as well know how this is going to end. That we have to have the small and the large if we're going to get the so what, the reasons for what we're doing, and have the what, the stuff to study so that we can get to the so what. And this entire talk is going to be really about going back and forth between various levels of smaller and larger, and going between the so what and interpretation and what. First, just a little bit of terminology and a little bit about the perspective I am coming from. And it occurred to me as I was listening this morning that sometimes we use the same words to mean slightly different things, and sometimes we use, I think, different words to mean the same thing. And though we're going to have discussion at the end, as I'm talking, if I use some word and you just wonder, what does she mean by that? Please feel free to just ask for clarification as we're going, because I'd rather have you ask than just be sitting there confused when it's something I could explain. And sometimes I don't even realize what needs explaining. So, corpus linguistics, in a very basic kind of definition, I'd say is an approach to investigating language use through computer-assisted analysis of large principled electronic collections of texts. And for me, text can be written or transcribed spoken, though today I'm talking about written. But this means pretty much everybody in this room who is doing digital humanities stuff also fits as a corpus linguist. And really, most corpus linguists would agree with that, just different foci. What I am especially interested in is register analysis, the big purpose of which is to see how people adapt their language use to different communicative functions and for different communication circumstances. And often we'll talk about a register as a category of text, and again, for me, that could be written or spoken, that is known by the cultural group. So one of the things I'm going to be using as examples this afternoon is engineering reports. And if you are in an engineering office and the supervisor says, well, write this up as a report, or write this up as a tech memo, or send me an email about this, right away, there are particular expectations people have about what those are going to look like, even probably subconsciously about the language features that are going to be in them. So it's that category of thing. And we can talk about it at a very general level. So you might talk about fiction writing, or you might get more specific to novels or particular categories of novels. And in corpus linguistics, we'll say that's fine. They're just different levels of register. What you need to be clear about is what level you're working at. The so what then is that bigger issue. How do we get at it? Well, what I'm going to be talking about is patterns of linguistic features. Now, there are other ways to get at register analysis, including techniques that look at features all the way through text, tracking them through text and then comparing lots of text. For this talk, since we're talking about larger, smaller levels, I wanted to pick the most challenging situation. So, patterns of linguistic features, and I wanted to pick the technique that I thought would be most illustrative for talking about the different levels, and that is multidimensional analysis. So I'm going to spend a few minutes setting up what this is in case you're not familiar with it. with, I'm hoping, enough detail so you can follow it, but not too much detail so we don't get bogged down in the detail before I get to the main example I want to use. And if you want more details, I'm happy to add those in as we go into discussion later on. So multidimensional analysis is a technique that Doug Biber first developed in the 80s. And he was especially trying to get at how spoken and written texts differ. Because at that point, there were a lot of contradictory findings. You know, sometimes speech was characterized as one thing, then it was something else, and then speech and writing were different in different ways. And he, I think, quite sensibly thought, well, it depends what perspective you take on them. And he wanted to get multiple perspectives at once. So the technique he thought through was to tag text for as many features as possible. And this number has grown as computational techniques have improved. For the example I'm going to be using, I'm actually employing analysis that first started in 1988. At that point, he had 67 different features. So these can be grammatical category types of things, complement clauses, relative clauses, word level, categories, nouns, verbs, some morphological characteristics, nominalizations, some semantic information, like you'll see reference to private verbs, which are verbs referring to those things that you can't see somebody doing, thinking, as opposed to a speech act kind of verb where somebody speaks and they're communicating about that. So to tag all those features in many different registers, in this case 23 registers, and then use a factor analysis to see what groups of features occur together in texts. And the assumption behind this, as somebody mentioned this morning, I forget who, but somebody mentioned, we choose language features subconsciously perhaps, but because there's meaning with them. So it's not like you randomly distribute linguistic features through what you're saying. You have something you want to communicate in a particular circumstance. So the factor analysis is useful because it shows mathematically what those groups of features are that occur together. And if you believe it's meaningful, well, then you have the fun task of interpreting, well, what are these features doing in the different texts? Some people hate factor analysis. The first paper I ever submitted to a journal by myself came back with a review that was about a 3-page rant of how we will never learn anything useful from factor analysis. But again, if you think linguistic features aren't just random things we use, I think that's a good reason for seeing how they group. The interpretation we can debate about, and that's something we could do in discussion also. So the factor analysis just shows you what groups of features from the statistical analysis. The dimension part of it is giving an interpretive name to that factor. So my little picture's down there. What really we're going to be going through is some very small little actual codes, not even the language itself, texts that have become numbers into dimensions, back to a smaller looking at lines of text, and eventually that's going to tell us something about this whole collection, we hope. Now, in case you're saying, now what's this groups of features and co-occurrence patterns, I just want to continue this quick illustration to show you this is something you actually are really familiar with. These two little snippets probably look totally ordinary to you. Here's a very little piece of conversation. Okay, I'll see you later. And then something from a textbook, which goes on about processes of producing and understanding discourse or matters of human feeling and human interaction, da-da-da-da-da-da. Probably doesn't strike you as anything really unusual in these. What I see as a linguist is, and what would come out from doing the analysis, the I's and U's in conversation, that contraction, the I'll, reduction, yeah, instead of you. These all turn out to be really common in conversation. And you can probably see how we need these things to regulate face-to-face interaction. It's going to be hard to do that without any I's and U's, to be referring to our shared context. Plus, in conversation, you don't have a lot of time to plan, or you can't revise things. It just comes out of your mouth. If you're too slow, people kind of wonder what's going on with you if you're sitting there planning. That happens to second language speakers sometimes. They take so long planning. It's like, all right, what's wrong? So there's pressure on you to keep doing it, so that there's the cognitive constraints of that. Whereas the textbook, well, it has very little concern with any kind of interaction between human beings. It's conveying information. That information needs to be very precise, specific. In conversation, you can get away with being vague later. Who knows what that means exactly? Textbook can't get away with that. It has to be more precise. And writers can do that because they have time to plan things out. You can revise multiple times. Most people cannot, just because of our cognitive constraints, come out with something like that textbook just talking off the top of their heads. They can't construct that kind of syntax. So linguistically, that academic prose textbook passage has a lot of nouns, prepositional phrases. You see it through prepositions, attributive adjectives, so the adjectives before nouns. Those tend to be really important for getting specific information across. And that gets to the precise processes, concepts, and comes from the being able to revise multiple times. Putting that on the dimension. So here, again, this just comes from the math, the co-occurrence patterns. One factor had features of what are called involved production, private verbs, so the things you can't see, that, deletions, contractions, present tense, first and second person pronouns, etc. The other end of the scale has nouns, long words, prepositions, higher type token ratio, attributive adjectives. The plus and the minus has nothing to do with good or bad. That's just math, showing these are in complementary distribution. It so happens when you look at a lot of registers, if the register tends to have a lot of those involved production features, it tends to have fewer of the informational production features, and vice versa. It doesn't mean it's absolute. It's relative, more or less. The scale, whoops, I'm doing the pointing thing. The scale there is from the 1988 study of 23 registers, that 0 is the mean for all the registers. So that's the middle for all these registers together. What you can't tell for something like fiction writing is it because there's a balance of features at different times and it comes out 0, or exactly how the numbers are working. But what it shows you is, not surprisingly, conversation uses a whole lot of those involved production features, fewer of the informational, and vice versa for academic prose. Which, if we go back to this little illustration, means that conversation sample is typical for the register of conversation, would be a high positive score on dimension 1. The textbook, typical for academic prose, very negative score on dimension 1. So that's the basic workings very quickly. Okay, so to get to my real example here, and this is where we get to something that's probably a little unusual for you. Writing in civil engineering. Most of my time right now is going to studying writing in civil engineering. And you might be thinking, now wait, aren't those the people who do things like design bridges and sewer treatment plants and roads? And yes, that's exactly those people. What I didn't realize until I started working with them is that probably the weight of all the paper, of everything you have to write behind an infrastructure project, it probably weighs more than all the cement and steel in it. There is just so much writing that has to be done, and most engineering firms don't produce anything but documents. They don't actually build things. They do plans, so some of what they produce in documents is drawings, but every drawing has lots of text with it, and it's all communicating clearly to get this thing built. And studies of infrastructure projects find that communication is the biggest variable in the perception of how well the project went. Now, what's particularly interesting to me gets to the questions here. How great is variation within the field, especially between academic and practitioner writing? For decades, employers have been complaining about the writing skills. This is every field. But engineering courses actually work quite a bit on writing. Students do a lot of writing. But what I saw immediately when I started to look at it was, the circumstances are not the same in academia as in practice. And I thought somebody should be looking at what happens in practice, which nobody was doing. So what I'm really trying to get at is it accurate to refer to the writing of the discipline of civil engineering? Or really do we need to be more specific about writing for engineering practice, writing in academia? And a good way to do that is with multidimensional analysis as one of the tools. If you don't know much about civil engineering practitioners, which I didn't until I married one, actually, and this is a good lesson in research growing out of kind of what happens at the dining room table. It was my husband complaining every night over dinner till this turned into 2 grants with the National Science Foundation for studying writing. But for practitioners, what they are focused on is a specific project for a specific client in very constrained context. They are not writing something that is meant to illustrate a concept or build the research in the field or anything like that. That's more the goal of research articles, academic research articles. So the purposes, the audience, the specificity differs in the academic and practitioner context. Okay, here's what we're going to be doing with this example. I was trying to think through, if we take a text in the middle there, well, the very largest piece, the largest aspect of this is the big so what of register analysis. How do people adapt language for different situational contexts? Immediately, though, that means we have to get to one very much smaller level, choose the linguistic features to analyze, and then a kind of intermediate, bigger than a text, though it is text, choose text to represent the register. Those go into counts of features of each text, which are not texts on 2 levels, because it's just the features plus its counts. So the language has actually now been transformed into numbers. And immediately with that, we're going to be looking at means for the registers. So larger than a text now. Still counts, numbers to represent something in language, and comparing means of the registers, so we're going even bigger for the comparison of different registers. Then we're going to be going back to smaller in order to start to get to the so what. So back here we had the biggest so what, then we're going through the whats to try to get at studying this, but we want to get to the so whats, which means then going back to specific occurrences of the features in text. But for this, I don't think I ever read through an entire text. I did for other purposes, but not for this. But then, as soon as you start looking at specific text, you think, well, is this really representative? Even if you know the numbers, it's like, well, what's going on in this text? So we'll look at a little comparison with the other texts, but then back to the specific features in texts, and always then looking at, well, what's a comparison with the other means, and back and forth. And then somehow magically, almost, we get back to the really big question of how do people adapt their language for different circumstances. So back and forth, back and forth. And none of this was a text. I'm hoping at the end I'll have a couple minutes to say things, though, about the application. And that's where I think a text really comes into it and is actually a challenge in corpus linguistics right now. And to be honest, what I'm really interested in is changing communication practices for the better, hopefully. So I like studying things with corpus linguistics to understand them. What I really want to do is have an impact and change things that I think need changing, which is how the civil engineering work all got started, to improve the teaching to students in courses. Okay, the corpus here, not really very big, in fact, small to me for this example. 81 practitioner reports, 50 research articles. People in engineering writing think this is the most incredibly large group of texts they have ever seen in their lives. Engineering writing studies tend to be done with a person, a case study of a person, maybe a class, and not with practitioner reports. People don't even know how to go about collecting them. I have found you ask. You go in and you ask. And what's important here, I think even more than the numbers, is many different firms. These were all firms in the area where the students I'm working with want to get jobs in the Northwest, and different journals for the research articles. So we're trying to get a variety of writers, not just the practices of one firm or in one journal. The steps, briefly, I think these have come out already. Tag the text for the grammatical information. I use the tagger that Doug Biber developed. Count the features in each text. So that is actually kind of a text level. Total the features for each factor from the 1988 study for each text. So as I mentioned, I'm employing the dimensions from the 1988 study, which adds a whole nother layer of scale to this. Calculate the mean for each factor for each of the registers. That's what you're going to see.
Sorry, are
yes?
the features composites of the individual tokens or something?
So the features actually get counted up. So there will be a count. This ATI is for a definite article. So each feature has a count. And then because I'm employing those 1988 dimensions, the dimension scores are composite for all the features on that side of the factor, if there are two sides to the factor. Okay, dimension one, which you actually saw before, the involved versus informational production. And it's probably no surprise to anybody that the academic articles and practitioner reports both are very, very strongly on the informational production end. Highly information-oriented, not concerned with regulating face-to-face interaction in things. And let's see what it looks like. So immediately, as I said, I think, let me see this in particular instances. What's in red in both of these examples here are features of informational production. So even if you don't read through it and just kind of look at the impact of how many of these features have to do with informational production, you get the sense, okay, that's a preponderance of things. And since I'm employing these previously interpreted dimensions, I mean, it is important to look at it and see, does this make sense for these texts? So it's something like rocking dynamic behavior of single pile foundations in granular soils, densely informational, very specific, precise information. Yes, looks quite typical for a high score on this dimension. But here's a case where I look at that practitioner report, and even though I know the means for the registers, I think, looking at that, it looks a little dense informationally. I wonder about the variability within the register category. So here's another level with a box plot. So the edges of the box show first and third quartiles. And the two we're looking at, so this is the academic articles and this is the practitioner reports. The practitioner reports actually for the central group there has so little variability. The means, the median, and the first and third quartiles can't even actually be represented fully on this because there's just so little variability. We need to expand it out. It's really unusual to have a category with that little variability. It also has, though, the zeros are outliers. If you are interested in what so far is appearing to be differences between private companies and public work, ask me about the outliers later on. So this is just getting another perspective then from a slightly different level of analysis of what are these registers like? How much variability is in them? And we could go back, look at more examples, investigate those outliers. But to keep moving here, let's step back to the so what. So what have we learned going back and forth between the levels and between numbers and linguistic features? And from this dimension one perspective, it's really, well, these two registers of civil engineering writing are similar, extreme informational production. So differences of audience, purpose, specificity doesn't seem to be affecting these features. So maybe we really have a writing in the discipline. But remember, this is multidimensional analysis, not unidimensional analysis. There are actually 5 useful dimensions. I'm just going to share one other. And that is, we typically call it dimension 5, impersonal versus non-impersonal style. Now, I almost dread using the word style in this room. But Doug Biber was the one who, he actually called this abstract versus non-abstract. And I thought impersonal is a little more what it gets after with most texts. But the idea of using style in this was more, writers have a little more choice, writers and speakers. So like on dimension 1, part of the constraints come from cognitive processing and from trying to regulate face-to-face at all. Here, it's a little more, I don't want to say aesthetics, but a little more choice to use passives, because what comes out in this factor is largely passives. Agentless passives, passives that have by phrases after them, past participial, postnominal clauses. So the bridge built in 1920 is still standing. So that postnominal clause is really the bridge that was built. So it's got a passive meaning to it. And there are a couple other features here, but largely this gets down to passive voice. And what you see is relative to a lot of registers in English, there's a lot of passive structures in both of the civil engineering registers. And that's why I think it's useful to actually apply these dimensions of many registers in English, because you see the wide comparison. But using an ANOVA, the academic articles and practitioner reports are statistically significantly different. So then, you say, let's look at some examples of things. You don't have to read those examples. This was just to note, oh, we're going into lines of text. So, academic articles, few typical examples. A research project was conducted. It is observed that, or there are some great phrases. You know, using a conditional PGV value of pseudo-probabilistic analysis is not recommended. I know I wouldn't recommend that. Or the inertial properties of the instrumented pile CP configurations that were employed are given in table 2. If you can make it passive voice, you pretty much make it passive voice. Sometimes, to me, even to the point of it being mysterious. I could have given you more context with that third one, is not recommended. I still don't know who exactly is not recommending it. Is it the authors? There's no reference to it. It gets a little mysterious to me. But I think it's part of the general academic research article. It shouldn't matter who did this. It's truth, kind of, building the knowledge for the discipline. Whereas the practitioner reports still have a lot of passives, remember, so the green marks the passives, but there are certain active voice sentences. The study team conducted, we observed, we recommend, we drilled. And immediately to me as a linguist, they said, okay, responsibility. You know, here's the agent, here's what they did. There's something really important going on here at particular points with showing we are the agents, blatantly, outright, overt. That doesn't happen in academic articles. But I'm not an engineer, so this really requires a whole other kind of scale for how much does this really matter to go to the human expert. Luckily, as I said, I have one in my house, so I can always ask questions of my husband and other practitioners who immediately say, absolutely crucial, having those points with active voice to show the firm is responsible for these particular things. This is what we observed. This is what somebody else wrote up or told us. This is what we recommend. And even here, the we drilled, this firm did not actually drill. They subcontracted to the drillers. But what it means is we are responsible for that work. So and what it means at the very bottom line is, if something goes south in this project and we all end up in court, here's what we were responsible for, and here's what other people were responsible for. And a lot of people think, oh, you know, legal liability and the threat of being sued leads to all sorts of weasel words. What I have seen is really it makes people write very specifically and unambiguously, which is a trick. You have to be unambiguous about what you don't know, or you only know within certain bounds of something. And if you make that clear, yeah, you have a certain amount of liability because they're professional firms doing things and they're liable for what they do. But if you're very clear about what you didn't know and what you can't count on, you are safer if things go south and you end up in court. And part of that really is the first person pronouns or the name of the firm and active voice. So now we've gone back and forth with the analysis, numbers and figures and levels of analysis with dimension 5. And what do we find? Well, the civil engineering registers have a high frequency of impersonal style compared to fiction writing or conversations, but the difference between them is significant statistically and important for engineering practice. So here, the difference in audience purpose, specificity of topic corresponds to a difference in the use of this group of features. And thinking of applications is one of the things that serves students in civil engineering courses and tech writing courses poorly, that they virtually never get even awareness of this, let alone any practice with that kind of thing. But we're interested in the linguistics and the scale levels. So let's go back to the big so what and the motivation for the study. Is it fair to talk about a monolithic writing in civil engineering? Well, from some perspectives, but not from others. So now, not only is it important to have these different levels of analysis and to be going back and forth, but now I'm saying, and we also need multiple perspectives on what's going on in the texts. So things get increasingly complicated rather than more straightforward. Why is it important? Descriptively, for understanding human language use, if you're interested in that, and applied, as I said, for helping student writers and new engineers and supervisors' levels of frustration and managing liability. Could we get to this understanding without multiple levels of analysis, multiple types of analysis? Is there a right level to look at? And remember, we went back and forth and through things. And one thing I can say is, well, people have been studying writing and engineering, not with this sort of technique, and nobody has come up with the research results that we have and describe texts in the way that we have. So apparently you do need all these different levels and this sort of analysis. And I lost the point I was going to make. So necessary to go through all the levels of analysis, which though then brings us to what about a text that I haven't dealt with very much, and the application. And so the bigger picture of what I'm working on has people at 4 universities trying out new teaching materials with students and then analyzing their writing pre and post using these materials and seeing if they get more proficient in ways that will help them in engineering practice. And what I'm finding is that there is a jump for students that I hadn't really anticipated. And working on this paper, I thought, you know, this really makes clear what that jump is. Because I'm used to seeing linguistic features in patterns and seeing them as representative of something going on in a register. And I know to write effectively, you have to make judgments about when to use those features for the particular places in the registers. And even though we show students many, many examples, explain things to them, give them annotated texts of what's effective where, what wasn't effective where, show them practitioner examples, the jump for them from here's the patterns and examples of them to working on a specific paper in a really specific context for this, just focused on this single text, is a much bigger jump than I have realized in the past. They need ever more guidance to, now I see it as, to get from the multiple levels that I know to their single text level and employ appropriate judgment and strategies for the single text. And with that, thanks to the NSF for funding and to all the engineers who made it possible. And when we get to discussion time, I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.